Today we're going to be talking about the Winston meta. This is going to be an in-depth talk covering all aspects of how to play the composition. This won't be a short talk because there's quite a lot of things to understand. It's not simply stuff as a lot of people describe it as sort of just like poking and forcing CDs and then you get an advantage. There's a lot of different aspects into it, which a lot of it breaks down into ebb and flow. But at a higher level, a lot of it has to do with map control, and a lot more like niche topics. So I will be covering all of it one by one, and please bear with me as it is going to be long. So let's first start with the composition. Winston, Sojourn, Reaper, Lucio. I'm like scared I'm gonna run my photo, and Kiriko. Okay. I'm not gonna go too much into why this is played, but I'll do a very brief summary. This, believe it or not, on this current live patch, the one that is played before OWL, this is actually considered meta at the highest level. Why? Because if you play Winston insanely well, Bubble is insanely broken to the fact that you can deny Zarya, and you can abuse high ground to the point where Zarya doesn't get any values and angles. Into D.Va, you can easily get a Sombra and hack D.Va, and D.Va doesn't get any value, or you can just play slow till D.Va has no resources, and then you can just burn D.Va. So, believe it or not, on this patch, technically, this comp is still broken, as well as the fact on the future patch, which is coming on the 14th, which you're seeing in OWL, this is like insanely broken for reasons being that the fact that Zarya is nerfed and D.Va is nerfed. Other things to understand is that sometimes Hog is played. I'm not going to be going into that video, but I will say Hog is played on certain maps as maps that are a bit more open that you can essentially bait Hog and abuse angles. But for now, we're focusing on the Winston comp. We'll talk about how it works and we'll go more into it. So the first thing I want to explain is target focus. So when you're playing this composition, when you're playing the mirror, one of the biggest things that people don't actually understand is that because this comp has such low heals, most of the time your target focus is going to be either Winston or Reaper. Now, this changes dynamically. What do I mean by that? That changes based off triggers off CDs. So, for instance, if someone, for example, Reaper has no Wraith, or Sojourn has no Slide, Kiriko has no Telly, if someone has no important CD, then you will change your target. But in general, your actual target is normally going to be Winston or Reaper, as well as your general way of playing is also a counter dive. This is a counter dive comp at heart. Again, I'll explain more of this in a second. So why is Winston Reaper your primary targets? Winston is your primary targets because the composition has very low heals, so keeping up Winston is very difficult. And once you pressure Winston, you will inherently force out Winston Bubble, which holds space. And if you force Winston Bubble and the Winston has no bubble, then you can easily roll over the enemy team, especially if you still have your Winston Bubble. The second thing to understand is why Reaper and Winston always play together. If you see a team where Reaper Winston is not playing together, 90% of the time they are feeding. There are some niche situations where Reaper Winston are not played together. If you notice that an enemy Reaper is like on one side of the map and the Winston's there, just run in to preferably the Winston, force jump, or you can run into the Reaper, force Reaper to Wraith and just chase after him and kill him. It is the freest thing ever. Okay, so in general, Winston and Reaper have to play together. The reason why is because they basically support each other and they basically create essentially a second tank. So why? Because the Reaper can get self-heals, and when Reaper plays in the bubble, he can just sort of hold space for quite a while. So let's sort of like look at how this sort of works in terms of a normal neutral brawl. And I'm going to break this up into a few different types of neutral fights. So there are a few different situations that can happen where you're sort of fighting corners. And this is the one that almost everybody talks about. Then there is actually one where you're talking about like baiting space is what I'll say. The other one is where you are hard inting. And there is also passive tempo. These are 4 different play styles of how this composition plays into a mirror or in general into like other compositions. So it's very critical you understand that this composition is just not played one way. In different situations, there are different reasons to do each one of these play styles. So first, we will talk about, before I go into these, I'm going to talk about each person's role, okay, on the composition. So we have Winston, we have Sojourn, we have Reaper, we have Lucio, we have Kiriko. Winston's role is very simply this. You want to think about this composition, and a lot of people talk about this as sort of a mixture of 6-man and the J-Queen comp, J-Queen Brawl. However, I still don't think it's like fully like that, because when you think of these like J-Queen comp, you mainly think of sort of corners and triggers and sort of like forcing CDs. When you think of the 6-man comp, you sort of think about like inting passive tempo, and sort of baiting space. But both of those, like, these playstyles come from each of them, but it's sort of like based off the playstyle you'll be taking it from different compositions. So when you play Winston, it's critical to understand that your CDs, or in general in any of these heroes, your CDs are critical. Your CDs, if you use them, the enemy team has an inherent advantage. And later, just to remind myself, we'll be talking about something. Let me not get posted there. 1 minute. We'll be talking about something called, put it down here, CD trading and alt trading, because this is also very important. But let's go back to the basics and talk about what Winston and how to play Winston. So for Winston, essentially how you want to always approach this is you always want to be playing environment. You are always playing corners. You should never, ever, ever be poking to like try and understand too much where the enemy team is. You can do a quick poke and come back in. That is it. Your armor is insanely valuable to you. You do not want to take a Sojourn railgun shot. You do not want to tell the enemy team where you are. I'll talk about why that in a second, because that will essentially let the enemy team force you out. So your job is to sort of play corners, sort of be hidden. And whenever you're looking to engage, you're normally looking to walk and not jump. When you do jump, you are looking to normally int or go hard. And what I mean by that is you're trying to get a kill and you're going in with an ultimate. You're like a specific reason to go hard. You are normally looking to always walk up, and then when you're low, you jump out or you jump up in the air. Jumping up in the air is very critical, and a lot of people don't do this, and it's very useful in this meta because the only range damage on the composition is only Kiriko and Sojourn. And based off where you jump up in the air, only Kiriko or so based off where you jump up, Sojourn may not even be able to see you. Hence, like, that's awesome because when you jump up, you basically will get heals from your Kiriko in air. Then when you go down, you'll actually hit the people you want and maybe force a cooldown with your jump pack damage. And you stay in the same exact space. You hold that space. So corners, hidden, you always want to walk, and when you're under pressure, you normally look to jump. Okay. Obviously you always want to be playing with your Reaper. That's sort of hopefully common sense. Sojourn, your job is to always take angles and be looking to, get your railgun shot, looking to sort of essentially poke the enemy Winston or Reaper out if possible, or like force their CDs. And that's one way of approaching Sojourn playstyle. The other one is looking for picks off your railgun. And to add to this, because I didn't talk about Winston's ult, your ult is generally used as disruption, but you can use it to go actually to kill. And if you're killing, you're going on the Sojourn. Because Sojourn, you jump on the Sojourn as Winston Primal, you force the Sojourn to slide out, then you'll commit on the Sojourn, Sojourn just probably dies, unless the Sojourn gets a lot of peels. Or your Winston ult is used as disruption, where like the enemy team pushes in with beat and you'll then Primal and split the whole team up, and it's very hard for them to target focus and kill anybody. Because for this composition, you need at least 4 people to be on the same target for somebody to die, generally. Unless someone pops off, like so Sojourn hits a 1-tap, Kiriko hits like a 2-tap. You normally, ideally want 4 people on the same target. Your E for Sojourn is generally used on chokes to try and force CDs, which we'll talk about later, which is CD trading. And it's generally used to sort of help your team take space, or if your team is kiting, it'll be used to essentially stop the enemy team from taking space. Reaper. So Reaper is essentially used when you play around your Winston. I'm not going to go too much into this, but you want to be very clean about when you're actually walking with your Winston and when you're turning corners to applying pressure, because it's very critical that both of you turn the corner together so that neither of you take any extra early chunk damage that doesn't actually allow you guys to have like longevity in the fight. If you turn let's say Winston turns the corner first and Reaper's not there and the enemy Reaper just shoots your Winston, then because your Reaper's not there to shoot their Winston, so it'll look something like, let's say there is a corner right over here and Winston Reaper, and let's say your Winston turns this corner and your Reaper chills here, and your Winston turns this corner, and because your Reaper's not there, both these people shoot your Winston's going to essentially get chunked and get screwed, and you're going to get forced out. So it's critical that when you're actually turning corners and taking space, 3, 2, 1, walking, 3, 2, 1, turning corner, stuff like that. So your Reaper can maybe get, if you are going first, which has a separate discussion, and if you really want to understand going first and going second, no. I think it should still be there. Oh, I had a heart attack. But if you really want to understand more of going second, going first and going second, you can like look at ebb and flow video. And I'll talk more about that also a little bit later. But if you're going first, you guys need to be in sync. And if you're lucky, the enemy team is in sync, and you'll shoot that Reaper and force that Reaper out first. Because in this situation, you always want to go on Reaper when you're turning corners aggressively, because if you force Wraith, then you'll inherently have an advantage. If the Reaper's not there, then you want to go on the Winston, because that's the next chunky target. And if you force the Winston out, then you can freely walk. Winston is very critical to force out, because especially when you're pushing into like a space, which I'll show examples in a second, because Winston's cleave is quite big. So Reaper, play with Winston. Try not to use your Wraith unless it's really needed. Your Death Blossom is insanely good mid-fight. Why? Because most people don't have CDs. So my favorite combo is just using it mid-fight with like an amp, Zuzu, and giving resources to essentially amplify your Reaper. You'll also see an example later by Carpe and how they sort of go explosive with the Reaper ult to sort of catch people off guard, and that can be done as well. But my personal favorite combo is Blossom Beat, because you give so much resources to your Reaper, and it's very hard for enemy team to actually do anything about it. Lucio, going back to the red here. Lucio, your job is essentially to use passive speed to help your team take space. Passive speed. So your team can play corners and go corner to corner. This is still like a brawl-based comp at heart. So you're pushing corner to corner, and that's very critical. And on top of that, you look to maybe get some valuable boops here and there, where you're maybe denying an enemy Reaper or a Winston. You're booping them from a corner into open space. But more than that, you're also looking to use your amps mid-fight. Like your amp heals mid-fight is very critical, because your team does have very low heals. Amping heals mid-fight is like very, very OP. On top of that, your target focus is again going to be on Reaper or Winston based off where they are. And Kiriko, you're essentially a heal bot. You should be looking to tag just a shit ton, and when you're taking a break from tagging, you throw a shuriken. Yes, there is like the whole Teru play style, but the fact of the matter is if you're DPS and your Reaper and Winston are playing like very proactively and like holding space and like poking a lot, then you're still gonna need to pre-heal them and apply a lot of heals. The one time I'd say maybe it's okay to like go on a flank a lot more as Kiriko is when you have map control, and because you have map control, your team essentially should be safe because they're hiding, so you can look for early poke and then back up. When you're looking to take space, it's a lot more greedy for you to go look to take those off angles, because since you're taking space, you're going to have to use CDs or you're going to essentially take damage. So generally, be a heal bot. You can look to flank if you really, really want to, if you have map control, but this then limits your team because they can't poke as much, which is like not very good. Its team. The other thing is you want to be looking to use your Zuzu when your team needs it. Do not hold it too long. Like when your team needs it and you think they're going to get chunked, just use it. You'll get it again. Kitsune Rush is very, very strong. And ideally when you Kitsune Rush very early to take space and you use a Zuzu instantly, and your Winston normally uses Bubble instantly because you'll get your CDs again. And normally because you get your CDs again, you'll start with the Zuzu, you'll start with Bubble so your team can walk up and take a bunch of space. And then in the middle of the fight, you'll use Zuzu again and another Bubble to keep going. Granted, sometimes you do not want to Zuzu very early if you know the enemy team has like Reaper ult or beat Reaper ult, because if you Zuzu really early and they beat Reaper ult, you push with Kitsune, you're just going to explode. So make sure you understand that the enemy team doesn't have a counter ultimate, or when you're pushing in, they don't have a way of pushing back in with an ult. That's sort of like basics. I want to talk now, I'll talk about this later because it's a more advanced. I want to talk about these different playstyles and show you guys some examples so you guys can understand what's going on. And before I go into this, I want you to understand that each person on this team sort of has CDs that help. So Winston, Sojourn, Reaper, Lucio, Kiriko. And I'm going to highlight the ones that are actually really important. Bubble is really important. Wraith is really important. Zuzu is really important. Yes, I'm not going to say that Amp Heals is not important and E is not important, but they're less important. These two are insanely important for being able to hold your front line. Zuzu is important because if you just inherently have a Zuzu advantage, you can push in and you have like a 13-second like gap advantage. So let's first talk about the very basic first example, which is sort of a corner-to-corner situation where both teams are sort of in a spot. So it's really important when most situations when you're playing, you're going to be in a corner-to-corner situation, and the general positioning looks like this. There is going to be someone on the outside of the map, and there's going to be someone on the inside. Now, not all fights will go like this, and I'll show you fights that don't look like this. But the first example is there's somebody inside and there's somebody outside. The person who outside, essentially, they have what I call map control, and they have point control. This is a very important thing to understand because they are essentially, in my opinion, I prefer this playstyle because this forces the enemy team to cut push into you. Well, and why is this valid? Because the enemy team has to push into you because you have point control. Even though Spark is attacking and they have point control, pushing in is very tricky because the enemy team has to push through said choke. And when they push through said choke, they have to use cooldowns. And that makes it very hard. So in this situation, London is at a disadvantage. But if London is very sneaky and London is very smart, they might be able to do something like very unpredictable, which will catch Spark off guard and maybe be able to be explosive and come out of his choke and get value. So let's sort of look at see how this works. Generally, positioning would be like Winston here plus a Reaper, and then you sort of have a Sojourn far back, you have a Kiriko far back, and you have a Lucio sort of like roaming. These two are always able to hold space. These two are sort of taking angles to try and pressure people, and they're further away so they don't take Winston cleave. And Lucio is sort of helping these guys. They need a kite back or kite forward. Because ebb and flow, like, we'll talk about passive tempo, but, like, yeah. So we'll look at this first. So, as you see here, E was used as a bad E. We're not going to focus too much on the cooldowns right now. Watch, we'll focus a little bit. So right over here, Bubbles used first by Gushue. He gets an insane amount of cleave. Now, what is very interesting about this is Alpha Yi is not playing over here. Now, the reasoning why Alpha Yi is not playing over here is because he knows that he could play over here, but he knows the only other possible spot that Hadi can actually jump to is right over here or really far back. If Hadi jumps all the way really far back, that's technically like giving space to Spark, which doesn't make any sense. Hence, this is the only good Spark for Hadi to go. So because of this, he is actually looking to hold this car here. So as soon as Hadi actually jumps here, Alpha is instantly on him. As well as the fact is Gushue here is not actually trying to play first at a higher level. He's actually trying to play second. He is just trying to like essentially do a 1v4 here and let this happen. And you'll see in a second where he goes, but he is just trying to apply a bunch of pressure. And then he instantly jumps up and he holds space. This is the concept I was talking about. Jump up and drop down. Normally when you drop down in the same spot, but Gushue knows that there's a little high ground here that he can play. And this high ground is very OP because it's very hard for certain people to actually hit him. So now we see Gushue sort of on this high ground applying lots of pressure. We see the Lucio with the Sojourn. The reason for this is because Lucio sometimes in these mid fights wants to peel against an enemy Winston, and the people that are up here do not need peel from, or do not need speed, or do not need any extra peel because they have their own CDs to be able to get out. And because they are playing second, they are playing to live and win the long duration of the fight. And if I didn't mention this earlier, because of this positioning inherently, this gives Shy a massive advantage because he has lots of room and stuff to work with. However, the person in here, sure, they can maybe pop out a little bit and get an advantage. But in this situation, Shy actually has a greater advantage. So you can see how enclosed London is and how much more value Shy is able to get. And now, right over there, Winston jumps in. Why does he go so aggro? Because they're down there Lucio. They can't kite, technically. They need to be really aggressive. They need to try and get a pick. They're playing around this corner now. Keep noticing how they're like Winston or Reapers and the team is constantly playing corner to corner. And now after this, they have the kites, so they back up. And as soon as that Winston backs up, they notice that, hey, Winston's out. Let's push in. Let's walk. Now, again, it's very critical to understand here that most of these situations, if the Winston is jumping in, they know that they will not explode because the team is with them, or like they're at some inherent advantage, or they are jumping on a corner. Winstons in this level do not jump in open space. You jump to corners, so you have natural environment. I cannot stress that enough. Otherwise, normally you are walking. And as you watch this, he's just applying pressure. He then looks at, he splits and forces those people out. And we'll just keep watching this. Gets one. And goes over here. And now they look to sort of group up. They're just killing people. Shy was out of position. He should have went high ground. and they end up capping. So that's one example. I want to show you another example right over here. So what's very interesting, and this is a very Korean style, if you watch playoffs, you'll notice that most teams in Korea value taking map control. Or, sorry, point control. Map control is flat. Point control, but point control is a bit more specific. So if you notice here, Dallas, they even telly, and they play on point. And granted, if Shock really noticed this and noticed at the telly, and they were really fast, they could have really just inted on Dallas here, because technically Reaper is really late. So if you watch this right over here, you'll notice that they play around point. And Chio's there. And that's pretty much it. But it's hard to see, but like Sparkle teleported out. So you see right over here, he teleported. So he's very late. Like you can see it right over there. And this is the same type of concept where Dallas here has point control, and Shock here has, I would normally say map control, but not really in this situation. But what Shock actually ends up having is a lot of different dynamic angles in which Proper can poke out of to try and get value. So this, believe it or not, actually plays a lot more for Proper, because it's very hard to know where Proper is because you can't see him. However, when you play over here as Sojourn, it's very hard to see. It's very obvious where the Sojourn is because there isn't a lot of actually natural environment. So now as this fight goes on, you'll notice actually what Dallas does. Once they're all here, they end up taking space and looking to choke them out. So Dallas can't walk. So right over here, you'll see that Fearless walks up, again, walking. Why? There's no actual pressure. He's able to walk. Walks to the corner, holds the corner with the Reaper, and is essentially choking this choke out. Very basic understanding. This is a choke. There are 2 kill boxes associated with it. We'll use blue. Blue is Dallas's kill box. If for some reason Shock were to push inside, that would be Shock's kill box. So ideally, you sort of just play around it so you have an inherent advantage. When you have an inherent advantage, you either push in or Shock would push out based off, advantages. So right now they are poking for CDs. So you can see right over here, that's not really the best E, but it is what it is. Bubbles are traded. Note how Edison's trying to get a pick. Proper missed his shot. And now they back up because they're low CDs. And Proper looks to come in. And he's very aggressive. And he just managed to catch Edison. And because he's Proper, he just, is insane. Bubbles trade. Same, stuff is happening. However, it's very important to note here, if you actually look at the Reaper differential, Reapers are not necessarily stacked here, I'm pretty sure. So if you look at here, Edison's right there. Chio's there. So if you look here, Striker and Mikey. And now, if you look right over here, Sparkle's a little bit further behind, but still there. And the other thing to understand is that when these Winstons are pushing in, note the bubble is for open space. The bubble is for here. So technically I was wrong, they work together. But my point is the bubble is to push into open space. If they were just poking on corners, they wouldn't need this bubble. They're using the bubble to actually push and press the W key. And then as this fight goes on, you'll sort of see what ends up happening. I'm pretty sure Shock ends up winning this fight. They milk because they're already up, or Zuzu because they're already up, and they just want to keep pushing really hard to make sure that enemy team doesn't come back. They're up 2 now, and they just go really aggressive for kills, not giving them time, and they win. So this is the concept of corner to corner, where essentially you are poking to essentially get a CD advantage, and once you have that CD advantage, you push very hard. It is critical to understand that sometimes you will have a CD disadvantage, and when you have a disadvantage, you are forced to kite. So for instance, if we were to look at this situation right over here, if in this situation, if Dallas had a CD advantage, if this is X1 where they were holding, they would kite back to X2. If Shock, for instance, was at a CD disadvantage and, needed to kite, let's call that maybe Y1, and they needed a kite, be honest, they'd probably just stay in here, because pushing it into an enclosed area is very risky because the enemy team can get shot from multiple angles and probably explode. So that's why Shock likes this, because if it's very hard for the enemy team to push in, it gives Proper a bunch of different angles that plays to him a little bit more. And essentially because you're able to see what the enemy Sojourn is, so it gives them a bit more value. But in general, I personally prefer playing for chokes and holding point control, because the enemy team has to push into you. And because they have to push into you, they have to use CDs first. And in this situation, I really like being able to go second because I have a CD advantage. So hopefully this should sort of make sense, the concept of sort of playing corners and sort of how the CD trades work. So this is essentially corners. Now, this is one way to play the composition, okay? I'm emphasizing one. And this can happen in neutral fights. This can happen, when you have map control. This can even happen when you're retaking. What do I mean by this? Well, this example right here is a neutral fight. Neutral is the first fight. It can also happen when you are retaking space. So for instance, this example, I think right over here, this was not the first fight. This was, believe it or not, in this situation, technically London had map control because they are defense. They had map control. But because of how Spark flipped the map around, they were actually able to get map control and turn it around into their favor. So technically, Spark was actually retaking here. Now, if you were to think about this as if you had map control like London, what London technically could do is like hold right over here and play for this choke and do this. Now, I'll say this isn't very good because when you hold hard chokes like this, if there's other angles to poke people out, they can get forced out. So I'll show you an example of this. When you're holding a hard choke, just like you did with maybe like, if everyone knows the Ryan May comp, if you find the May, you poke the May and force the May to cry or force the May to wall early, then it doesn't work very well. Likewise, with this composition, when you're trying to actually hold chokes like this really aggressively and the enemy team sees you, your value is pretty much lost. Because what'll end up happening is a Lucio or Sojourn will take some angle and poke the Winston or poke the Reaper and force them out. Once said person is forced out, you have a CD advantage and you're able to walk very aggressively and you're able to push in. I will talk about how to change this soon and how this translates to the second type of playstyle. Okay, so holding aggressive chokes is not always the right answer. And I'll even show an example of this right over here. So right over here, sometimes you'll see like a Winston holding right over here, and the choke they're playing for is right here, and they're applying a bunch of pressure. So it's Winston plus Reaper. And, you know, when the enemy team tries to walk up, you know, they have to push past this choke. And this isn't that great. Why? Because of a good Sojourn, what they'll do is they'll actually come right over here and they'll shoot the Winston like this. And because they shoot the Winston, the Sojourn is building a lots of alt charge and building railgun so they can get a pick, but it's maybe going to force bubble. If it forces bubble, that Winston now is forced back out. So the Winston now will be forced to back out maybe to over here, maybe X2, their second kite point, which may be X1. So they're forced to back and take space. Granted, this person could get marked by your Sojourn or maybe like get poked out by your Lucio or Kiriko, but this is the fact of the matter, is when you're playing very aggressive like this, you're hoping that you can go in very early and int, which I'll talk about int playstyle in a second, or you're hoping to go for this corner-to-corner playstyle, but if the map is open, it is very probable that you can get poked out from another angle. That's why this choke playstyle is only good in enclosed areas where you can't get angled on. And if you notice an enemy team is doing this in open base maps, think about pushing lanes and pushing sides to be able to poke them out or force them to drastically move, so you have an advantage. So, just like how I talked about right over here, about how, you know, holding close is not necessarily good because you can get forced out and people can scout you. How can you work around this? Well, the next type of like working around this, so if there's like a Reaper here and a Winston right over here, and, you know, Sojourn maybe just comes over here and starts shooting, or a Lucio starts booping them or something, the way of approaching this or working around is actually the concept of baiting space. So how does baiting space work? Baiting space essentially works where you are letting the enemy team through the choke, but you are hiding. You are not showing the enemy team where you are as Winston. You are not showing the enemy team where you are as Reaper. So because of that, the enemy team cannot force you out. So an example of a flat map of this, because we're looking at this map, is a Winston hiding right over here. This is a very classic example. Winston hiding right over here, and maybe Reaper hiding in here, or maybe Reaper being up here. It's also another example of, so I can get another example of maybe Winston hiding up here. That's another example. In both these examples, like, it is very, very hard for the enemy team to know where the Winston is. So guess what? They will walk up for free, maybe make a rotation 1 or rotation 2, or maybe even rotation 3 or 4, and not know what to do. And because of this, the enemy team can pinch and go in and catch the enemy team off guard. They can maybe turn and catch, maybe like, for example, let's say this is the enemy team and you're defending your London. You turn over here and you just catch Gooseway and Alpha off guard, immediately shoot Alpha, force the Wraith, and you have an advantage. And this is very, very, very strong. Now, what's important is to understand how to counter this concept in this map. In this map, the way of countering this is taking map control. Just like I talked about on right over here in this example, how the Sojourn is able to take an angle and poke them out. If you don't know where the enemy Winston is, where'd my thing go? Wait, it was somewhere here. It was here, yeah. If you don't know where the enemy Winston is, whether it's here or in that little high ground, let's make this bigger. Whether it's here or this high ground right over here, take map control. Like maybe Winston jump all the way over here and play this corner. Kiriko Telly, Sojourn, Lucio maybe play over here. Sojourn play over here and look to sort of maybe push this side here and then see if the person's there. If they are there, start shooting the person from an angle and force that person out. Guess what? You force that Winston to jump out, force that Winston to bubble. You now have a CD advantage. Because when you're taking space, you scouted and you understood that the Winston is not, like, you understood the Winston is hidden, so you need to force that Winston out. You need to force that Reaper out. Okay? So I hope this makes sense of how to counter this playstyle and how this playstyle also works. So let's see some examples from Spark on how they actually execute this playstyle against London, because it is quite clean, and London gets smacked. Oh, wow! So, right over here, one thing why Spark, I think, is such a good team is not just because they have Gushue or they have, you know, Shy or Alpha Yi. It's because they understand how to manipulate the map into their favor. And because of that, you know, Gushue inherently gets a lot of value. So if you look at the start of this fight, Spark is quite smart. They put Gushue in a really OP spot, which is right up here. This spot is very OP because Reaper can't just push it, and your Winston is above, so Reaper gets very little value. The only person who can really shoot is really a Sojourn and a Kiriko, and that's it. That's literally it. So ideally, you can hold here, apply poke, and if enemy team rotates, Winston just drops and just like pressures your backline, and then you just jump out. So Winston's able to hold space without taking any pressure. So look at some sort of holding space. Note here that London sees them and instantly forces them out because they know that if we need to take space, we need to force Winston Reaper out. Otherwise, we won't be able to walk. Now, note, Sparker uses Overclock to try and kill Winston. Overclock, you know, again, if Winston's low, blow heals, by all means, blow up the Winston. So right over here, just poking. Now, what's critical to understand the situation is, yes, London is taking a lot of space, but Spark controls the high ground. And every single time that, like, they try and push here, Spark still controls this space. Okay? Granted, it would be better if Spark controlled a little bit more over here, but Spark still controls this. And the worst part about this is London is pushing low ground. This is a huge mistake. Huge. Note how, you know, Spark is not really hard contesting space. They maybe soft contested it over here, and then they kited, and now they're holding in what I like to call a power position. This is like the most important spot on this map is this top area. They're holding this. And as London does this, they're just pushing cart and they're trying to soft push this high ground. And the logic could be from London that, hey, you know what we're going to do? We're going to turtle where we're going to play below them and we're going to push cart and we're going to keep soft diving and keep pushing point. And if we need a turtle, we're going to kite in here and just keep pushing. We'll push the cart here. Then we'll, you know, come in here, push it and cap. And we'll just play under them. So you can see the, you know, the turtle happening. Now, the problem with this is that who has to push cart? Backbone does. And the other issue is they're literally playing in open space. This is open space. This comp is not meant to be played in open space. It's meant to be playing corner to corner. And at a really high level, I didn't mention this, but high ground is also a type of corner. Because if you're right over here and you back up, you technically have environment cover. So technically, Spark is abusing verticality in this situation as a corner and making it very hard for London to do anything. And if you watch this, just by this happening, I want you to look at the CDs now that were forced. We talked about CDs and how they were critical in corner-to-corner situations. Look at this situation right here. So right over here, Backbone gets 1 HP. He is forced to Wraith. Zuzu is also used. So now not only Wraith was used, but also Zuzu. Hadi also uses Jump here and uses Bubble. All CDs were forced because London is an open space and Spark is controlling, again, the power position. Now, in this situation, Gushue is having the time of his life. This dude is partying, man. He's like, they got no CDs. I got my CDs. I'm cleaving from above. This is great. So look at this. Look at this cleave he gets. It is disgusting. Then he jumps in here because they're low, and by himself, he primals, and he just kills everybody. So what's critical to understand here, and I'll show you another example of this, is you do not need to play corners. You do not always need to play aggressive. You can bait space if you hold the critical areas on the map. And high ground is a great example of this. In the olden days, you had something called ping pong, where your Winston would drop, and Winston would go up, and the Diva would drop, and Diva would go up, and maybe Tracer, then Sombra. However, you can still do this with just a Winston. It's going to be slow, and it'll work, though. Why? Because there's only one tank in the game now, and because there's only one tank in the game, it's harder to like be in open space. If you had 2 tanks and like you could have D.Va go in and then D.Va would go out, then maybe Reaper and then Reaper go out, but you can't do that anymore. So that's how this ends up working, and Spark ends up winning.
No matches? Let's fix that.
Let's look at another example of this. So here is another example of where London is going for roughly the same type of concept. And this is a more interesting situation because this fight starts where Spark is down 1. So Spark is actually down Lucio. And I'll be straight up honest, super rich fed. Hard fed. So now, Hadi's soft diving high ground. And again, look at this position that Gushue is in. This is a great position for multiple reasons. First of all, if anyone tries to shoot him, he just hugs the corner and he lives. He's in a position where his Kiriko can heal him and he can just live, and he's holding a critical piece of space on the map, which is this high ground. The team is holding the other critical space, which is the gas station. So they're holding space, and because of this, they are essentially funneling this London to essentially play low ground. So this is what Hadi does. He pushes uncontested space. He pushes right over here. But however, this is not that useful. Because then guess what? They can just play above. So Hadi's thinking. You can even see he was thinking how to approach this. So what do they end up doing? They end up turtling. And they're turtling point. And by now, you'll actually notice Super Rich is back. Now, I want to clarify something about this concept. When you're playing slow and you're playing second, it's not always going to work. It's not always going to be textbook like this. You could be playing against Proper, and Proper just like slides in here with a railgun shot and shoots your Kiriko, and you just lose. That could happen. So you have to understand that like playing slow and playing second won't always work. But in situations where maybe you're at a disadvantage, or in situations where like map geometry is massively in your favor, it is very strong. So note here how Gushue sort of just drops, and then he looks to, force CDs. And we'll talk about CD trading. We'll talk about alt trading soon in a second after these examples. So drops here, looks to get pressured. He instantly gets forced out. But because of this, everyone is able to shoot backbone. So he trades a Winston jump for a Reaper Wraith. And that is totally worth it. Now Reaper has no Wraith. However, the enemy team is sort of still hugging the corner and sort of playing an inside area where they're not able to do anything. Hadi makes a great call here and pushes to this high ground because he doesn't want to give Shy this angle. So Hadi has a really good understanding here to take map space here. Backbone's trying to hard force point and trying to turtle. However, that is not a great perspective. And again, you constantly see that ping pong here. Look at that huge E come out. And Hadi has to soft dive while they keep forcing point. But every time he has to soft dive, he has to use jump. And he might have to use bubble. And right now, Hadi has no bubble and is 1 HP and does not have primal. In this situation, Spark is very ahead. And in this situation, it's even better because London splits. Half people go here and half people go here. Gushue instantly recognizes this, jumps on this high ground and uses this high ground so it's harder, and then plays this corner here. And watch what happens. And as soon as this happens, everyone realizes that they have to go peel, which is still somewhat of a mistake. Why? Because when they go peel, they're going to get shot by Spark in a crossfire. And they're thinking, hey, we can kill Gushue because, he has no jump and no bubble. But the team still has a slow, team still has a Zuzu, so he's able to live. And then again, what does Gushue do? He jumps up in the air, comes back down. And now it's very free. And they just clone up and they clean everybody up. And what's critical to also to understand here is the person they killed here is Reaper, and because Reaper is dead, that's the majority of the damage for London. Hence, it's very easy for Spark just to press the W key and blow everybody up. Likewise, if Spark were to kill Landon, the main healer, if they played slow for a little bit, spammed out a little bit, then the enemy team would, sort of die over time and you would just win. So hopefully this makes sense. This concept of, you can bait space, bait them in, and then go aggro. And another example of this on this map is without using high ground is actually putting your Winston right over here. So if the enemy team pushes in and they don't see the Winston and they keep going up, and then the Winston sort of comes from behind and cleaves on everybody, Reaper drops, and your team pushes in, you can now then again get a lot of value. Okay, so now we've talked about baiting space. Now we'll look at a very simple example of inting. It's nothing crazy. It's very simple. This is a very interesting fight because in this fight, Philly is down ult economy. And it's a very critical fight because if Philly loses this, London just wins. And you can't always play this like baity style when the enemy team has a massive ult advantage. Because sure, you can maybe live one engage by maybe them like Kiriko ulting. And this sort of goes into passive tempo. Actually, let's do passive tempo first because it'll make more sense. So let's first talk about passive tempo. What is passive tempo? Passive tempo is another type of like way of playing the game. So we'll do this first. So you saw corners, which is sort of like in neutrals, map control, and retaking. Baiting space, which is normally done in neutrals if you give space first and then fight for where you want. And it's also done normally in map control. It can be done in retakes, but you really have to like manipulate the map into your you have to manipulate the map to get where you want on the map, and it's very tricky to do. So it's normally done in these two. So let's first talk about passive tempo. So this is passive tempo is essentially what I call when you are looking to play first because of your positioning, but you're actually playing second. And the idea for this is that normally you have map control when you're playing passive tempo. You can do this when you don't have map control, but ideally when you have map control because it's easier to have that frontal staging. What this looks like is when you're looking to essentially set up really aggressive, like really aggro, and the enemy team, looks to push in, and, you can't just push in for free anymore. Like, you just can't. That's not how Overwatch 1 works. Maybe your DPS have to flank. Maybe you have to use some CDs. Maybe you have to use an ultimate. A very common ultimate is Kitsune Rush. So maybe you use Kitsune Rush, you take space, you go in really aggressive, and as soon as the red team sees Kitsune Rush, they're holding, let's call this Y1. They already know where they want to kite. They want to kite over here, Y2. So as soon as Kitsune Rush comes, they instantly kite back to Y2 and they live. And because of this, they just force an ultimate. Then they force the enemy team into this area. And after that, maybe now they push back in. Or maybe they just chill and poke. Maybe they're still waiting for ultimates to come up. So they chill and poke and play slow. And once they have the ultimates, then they push back in. Maybe they have an ult after, and then they push back in with their Kitsune Rush. And there's a really good example of this, and I will link in a description of actually Shock versus Philly in a grand finals of them showing passive tempo. And it very much applies to this meta. So that's passive tempo. Now, going back to inting. So in this example right over here, sure, we could see passive tempo. We could see technically the bridges here, little stands there. We could see Philly, holding this little corner here and then baiting London to use Kitsune Rush and sort of going really aggro. And then London at Philly after this, essentially like kiting back and like playing point. But the problem is these guys have so many ults that you can only kite so much. Like it's just not be like you just can't kite forever. Like it's just not possible. So you push in, you force them out, you kite them over here. So this is Y1, you kite them back to Y2. They use Kitsune Rush here. Then after that, they'll probably use Beat, and then they'll just run you over. And you can't kite anymore because you use CDs. I mean, maybe you could jump out and Reaper could Wraith, and then you can amp speed out. But like, it's just going to inherently be too difficult. So Philly realizes this, and they're like, you know what? We love passive tempo. We're a Korean team. We love playing slow. We love playing second. But it's just not feasible when they have double support ultimates. We'll talk about double support ultimates later. But like double support ultimates is broken. And especially if you have the enemy team has 2 support ultimates and you have 0, you are in trouble. You need to be thinking a lot about how to get value. So Philly realizes this and is like, okay, we're in not a great spot. How do we get around this? Okay. So immediately Carpe, who for what I've heard is a very smart RGL. Personally, I do not think he is mechanically strong anymore, but he's smart. If he made this call, this is the smart call. He tellies from here to here, both situations. This telly can't be seen by the enemy. This telly can't be seen by the enemy. So the enemy team has no idea that he's not actually with a Winston. And they look to set up a very early engage. So you'll see Carpe actually path like this and drop behind. So you'll see Carpe drop behind like there in a second. So Winston jumps in early. Carpe comes from behind. Winston bubble, Reaper ult, Zuzu, speed. Oh, so many resources are given to Carpe to sort of get value very early on, and they get an early pick. And unfortunately, you know, this forces both ultimates. That one ultimate, we'll talk about ult trading a little bit later, but that one ultimate forced double support ultimates. That is huge for Philly here. Like, that is just such a good trade. On top of that trade, they also got a kill. This couldn't have gone better for Philly. Like, this is like icing on the cake. I also realized here that this is being covered, so we'll move this down a little bit. Or I'll put it way over there. And now, you know, it's all about living. So if you notice, everyone on Spark instantly kites back. So you see Bella Rosa kites back to the corner, try and hold soft space. Sojourn's holding here. Everyone's sort of backing up. Carpe looks to back up. Bella Rosa holding a bit too much aggressive space, and he wasn't really getting properly healed clearly because he's very low. However, he's trying to min-max to build his ultimate. And now the only ult that London has is this and this, and they're closing on these. So the question now is, you know, who ends up winning this? And unfortunately, the answer is London does, because Sparker's insane. And Bellariza has a really bad primal. He, like, jumps. When you're primaling, do not just jump forward into a Reaper or jump forward into a Sojourn. That is not smart. You want to jump from an angle where they're not looking at you. So the jump, when you're jumping in this area, you're not taking damage. If you're jumping like this amount of time, you're going to take an insane amount of damage. You're going to get chunked. So this is a very, very bad, like, primal engage. I'm not sure why he did this. Because you can see he's literally jumping into them and he instantly gets burnt. And so his primal literally gives him 0 value. And the reason why he was primaling is because he knew Sparker had ult. His goal was to primal to go on Sparker and force Sparker out, and then eventually have a team win by MM3 getting ult and Aim God building ult and then pushing back in. However, that didn't end up working because Sparker didn't get denied because he messed up. And Sparker gets picks, killing people. Backbone goes hyper aggressive and they just win. But the idea is that inting is good and you can int. You don't need to play slow corners. You don't need to play second and hold map space all the time. You can int. You just need to be tactical about it. Okay, so that sort of covered everything. That covered corners, that covered baiting space, it covered inting, it covered passive tempo. Those are like the 4 types of playstyles. They're usable pretty much anywhere. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about CD and ult trading. I'm not going to go too much into this, but I just want you to understand that this is a thing and it is very critical. So when you look at this composition, there are certain CDs that are more valuable than others, just logically, which is Bubble, Wraith, and Zuzu. These are very valuable CDs. And the next thing I'd say for alts, what are the most valuable ultimates? Well, I'll answer that question at the end. Ult trading, the next valuable ultimates are Beat and Kitsune or Kiriko ult. I don't know how to spell this, like Kiriko ult. And you can maybe say, I pretty much say those 2 are the most valuable ultimates. If you're like Sojourn's insane, then maybe Sojourn ult. But these are the most valuable ults. These are the most valuable CDs. So now when you think about CD and ult trading, if essentially you are able to force these CDs using less valuable CDs, for instance, maybe you use mini grab or bubble. So you mini grab and that forces bubble. That's not, let's be real, it's not realistic. But what might happen is mini grab for Wraith. Mini grab actually for Zuzu because you do it on squishies and you have some poke. This trade is so advantageous for this team because it gives you such a CD advantage that, like, you can just inherently win. And these CD trades are critical to import, like critical to understand, critical to try and get value out of. This is when you're using CDs like very well. There's also more like higher level CDs where maybe you use a bubble and that bubble forces Wraith plus Zuzu. That bubble is also very valuable. So understand that it's not just like one CD for one CD. No, you can maybe use one CD to force multiple CDs. And this might happen because maybe these guys don't have a Winston on them. So, you know, the bubble is just so valuable because the Winston's not there with the Reaper or Kiriko. And, you know, the bubble's there. It forces Wraith and then the Reaper's going to die. And then Zuzu's needed. And, you know, or maybe they mess up and they Wraith and Zuzu at the same time. Who knows? But understanding like that these trades can happen and recognizing it in game and being like, oh, you know, I forced Wraith and Zuzu. We can push. We have a CD advantage. Not saying stuff like, oh, I'm going to go for a bubble to a Wraith Zuzu trade. Like, no, that's not realistic. That just doesn't, like, you can't predict that's going to happen. Now, if something like that happens, though, you can be like, we have an advantage of this and this. We can push more aggressively. Okay. Now, that's CD trading. There is also alt trading, and then I'll also actually get into one more, which is actually CD for alts trading. I don't know what happened to why it's thicker, but it's thicker. Oh, I see what happened. So first, let's talk about CD trading. So Beat and Kiriko alt are the most valuable. Then what are the least valuable? Well, you've got Primal, you have Sojourn alt, and you have Reaper alt. Blossom. Now, if you just think about this logically, if you're in a situation where you have 4 ultimates and the enemy team has 4 ultimates, and you both have both support ultimates, and your team uses Blossom and it forces both support ultimates, you will probably just inherently win. Because if you use Blossom and you force both support ultimates, and then you have your support ultimates left, you will probably win. If you use Primal and you force the enemy Beat, and then from there you still have your Beat and Kiriko ult, logically in the ebb and flow thing, if you do not mess up and or the enemy team is not very good at kiting, you will probably win. So understanding that like using ults to try and force enemy ultimates is very, very good. Now, obviously that isn't always going to happen. It's not textbook again, but sometimes it can happen. And especially when you look at the ball meta, when you're playing ball and you would mines the backline, and sometimes that would force trance, that is good. Sometimes when you would play Tracer and you would go on like a Zen and force trance, or maybe you'd pulse the Zen and force trance, again, very good. So simple examples like this about trying to go for positive alt trades that gives you an advantage is something you should be looking for. The last thing is CD4 alt trades is maybe you use a bunch of CDs like Bubble, Wraith, I don't know, Zuzu, and you're super aggressive on the enemy team, and it forces you force the let's see, Lucio to beat because somebody's low. Like that's one. You could also hard target the Winston and force Primal. I'm not saying that's good because I don't think that's good unless the enemy team's not there to follow up. If Winston has Primal, normally you just want to ignore it, kill somebody else because it's going to be very hard to deal with him. Unless the Winston's very far away from his team and it's in a closed area, then it's worth killing, like blowing him up. But yeah. So that's that. That's CD alt trading. Let me show you. Okay, so there's other concepts that I'm not going to go too much into, but ebb and flow exists. And another concept that also exists is understanding mid fights better. And that's obviously part of ebb and flow. And what I mean by mid fights is understanding how deaths affects your team. Like if you lose somebody, what are you supposed to do? If the enemy team loses somebody, what are you supposed to do? And that's something that like I talked about a little bit. Like if the enemy team loses Reaper, then you have an inherent damage advantage. Go aggressive, you'll win. If you kill their Kiriko, you keep poking, you'll probably win. So that's there's also actually spawn advantages and how spawns work. And there's also a few others too. So I'm not going to go too much into these. If you're interested in this, look out for my ebb and flow video. I already have one up. I'll also maybe do one specifically for this. If you're interested in mid fights in this, I'll have a separate discussion on this. This talk has already gone very, very long. But I do want to show you guys probably one of the most outrageous kites and most outrageous ebb and flow things I've probably ever seen. And it is just nuts. So we're going to watch this one and I'll show you one more example. In a situation, you know, this is the grand finals. It's Shock versus Dallas. And Dallas is looking to push here. They have no ultimates. They're closing on Primal. Shock has Reaper ult and Kitsune, and they're looking to play very aggressive. And right over here, Edison C Striker gets a huge pick. As soon as this happens, Shock realizes that, hey, we lost our massive damage dealer. We need to go hyper aggressive because if the fight goes long, we will just inherently lose. So they Kitsune ult and they go really aggro. However, Dallas is expecting this, and as soon as this happened, Dallas knows exactly where to kite. So right over here, the Kitsune ult happens and they kite. So in terms of ebb and flow, just for people who don't know ebb and flow, it's push and pull. When the enemy team goes aggressive, enemy team went aggressive, Shock, they're going first. Now after this, because of this kill, now Dallas would technically go aggressive. But before Dallas can even go aggressive, Shock goes aggressive again. And they Kitsune ult. And right when that Kitsune ult happens, immediately Dallas kites because they know that they need to back up. And they all beautifully kite to like the middle area. And they're not able to push in. Why? Because this is a choke, and if they push in when they used all their CDs such as Bubble, Kitsune, Zuzu, they will essentially get blown up. Now when this happens, Shock pushes the payload. However, Dallas is ready for this, and Dallas instantly rotates down. And after they kite, they want to push back in because now they have their Kiriko ult. They push back in, and they use the Kiriko ult right here. And they go in very aggro. And now they end up winning that fight. So this is one example of ebb and flow. I will show you one more. This one is with insane kiting. Like that kiting was so beautiful. Now you might ask me like, who is doing the kiting? I do not know. I've heard maybe it's Fielder, but it's something as simple as like, if they go really hard, I want to kite this way. That's all you need to say. Like I want to hold aggressive and try and be aggressive. If they go hard, I want to kite here. Let's start. Maybe you can do some of this. Let's start. Let's try and go first. But if they go first, I want to do this. So you can use if statements to essentially plan and have different conditions based off what actually happens. So let me show you one more example. So a little added bonus treat for some people that didn't think about this, and I'll do a separate video on this. Spawn advantage is very, very important in Overwatch 2. And whenever you're in situations like this, or when the card's a little bit further down, Shock has an inherent advantage because since it's 5v5, and if you lose somebody in 5v5, then you're just at such a big disadvantage that it's so hard to win the fight. And let's say if this fight happens and the card's like right near capping, let's say Spark has like 4 ultimates or 5 ultimates, Shock only has 2. If Shock literally just goes for like a trade, and because they have spawn advantage, the person can literally just come right back. Like Kiriko can like tele from spawn. Shock can like easily win that way. So because of spawn advantage, when you have a defensive spawn advantage like this, you can play for that and get a lot of value. Likewise, on King's Row first point attack, in this situation, if Spark was attacking and Shock was defending, Spark would have a spawn advantage if they were attacking, and Spark could technically go for proactive trades on first point attack, and if they got a trade, then they would stabilize. It'd be 5v4, be 4v4, but then Spark would wait for the one person to come from spawn, come back, and it'd be 5, and then they'd push the Shock would only have 4 people because the person's still coming back from spawn, and then they would go in. This is very relevant because in certain situations when you're attacking on first point King's Row, you might already be down 2 and you might necessarily give up. You should not. You should go hyper aggressive and look for 1 or 2 trades, because if you get those, again, respawns will come in, you'll push in it with a numbers advantage, the enemy team will be forced to give space. But let's watch this ebb and flow fight because it is very interesting. So if you look at this fight right over here, this fight is like insane. Why is this insane? Because right now, Shock has a massive ult advantage. It's literally 4 ults to basically 1. Technically, this is like a winning losable fight where like if Spark wins this, that is nuts. The only way Spark's really going to win this is to play the ebb and flow really well, or Shy is nuts and gets an insane pick. So let's see what happens here. So Guxue's applying some poke. Proper's really aggressive. Proper instantly gets shut down. That's a great pick from Shy, which gives them a big advantage, right? And because of that, Shock might look to back up. They do look to back up. Spark pushes really aggressively and try to get more value. But because they're so far forward and Guxue jumped in, Shock's like, hey, we can Kitsune and run over Guxue and be really aggro. So they Kitsune. Guxue jumps out because he still had jump and he jumped near a corner initially. They back up. And now, in this situation, Spark is trying to live now and live their push. But now Spark pushes back in with Kitsune because they have it. And right when this happens, instantly Shock wants to push back in and use beat Reaper ult. However, it's Alpha Yi plus technically, I'm pretty sure Shy hit Striker, blowing him up. Which now, this puts Spark in a very, very big advantage where now they have beat and Reaper ult and Shy's ult, and Shock only has Proper's ult. And now because of this, they're effectively able to win this pretty much. And they're able to cap. So going from essentially a situation where you're down ult economy, and yes, that pick definitely helped, but it wasn't just that pick. It was the fact that they pushed really aggressive and they baited, you know, another Finn to use that Kitsune ult, and then Guxue was able to disengage. When they disengaged, they were like, okay, we can re-engage. And when they re-engaged, they were expecting Shock to come back in with the beat Reaper ult. And as soon as that happened, they were ready and they just blew up Striker. And because of that, they were able to sort of win because they ended up using less ults than Shock. And as the fight went on, because they started with only 1 or 2 ults, they built more ults. And Shock, because they had a bunch of ults to start, they used a bunch, they ended up with lower. And that's how they ended up winning. So this is a great example of winning a losable fight.